Hi, my name is Leslie, and I'm the Development Associate for Avalon Center. Welcome to our second episode of Avalon Voices. Our topic today is sexual violence, and I'm here with our Director of Outreach Services and Counselor, Juanita Graham.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm good, how are you?
Doing well.
Juanita, can you explain to us what sexual violence is and why we're calling it sexual violence instead of rape or assault?
Well, sexual violence involves non-consensual sexual behavior. It is when a person is coerced or physically forced to engage in a sexual conduct against their will. The term sexual violence is an all-encompassing kind of word. It's a non-legal term that they use that refers to lots of different crimes like rape and sexual assault and sexual abuse. The perpetrator may be a stranger. It may be somebody that's an acquaintance, a friend, or a family member, or an intimate partner even. Sexual violence impacts everyone, and it is something that the society as a whole we need to start to address more seriously. Before we talk about the different types of sexual violence, it is crucial that we talk about one important concept, and that's consent.
Well, tell us about consent.
Well, the legal definitions for different things like rape and sexual assault, they vary from state to state, but in each state, consent is an important role in determining whether an act is legally considered a crime.
So here in Virginia, what do they consider consent?
Well, it's defined as the voluntary agreement of both parties to engage in sexual activity in question. Conduct short of a voluntary agreement to engage in any kind of sexual activity does not consist of consent.
So conduct such as what?
Well, someone can't give consent if they're not old enough. Someone can't give consent if they're intoxicated. Someone can't give consent if they're mentally or physically unable to give consent. So those are the important pieces to realize that consent means you have to be able to consent one way or the other. And while consent can be a confusing topic, it's one good way to look at it. If you go to YouTube, there is a video called Tea Consent, and it's written by the Blue Seed Studios, and it does a wonderful job of describing consent in terms of drinking tea. So it's a very clear, concise, short way of trying to help people understand what is involved with consent.
So in talking about sexual violence, when do we use the term sexual assault?
Well, sexual assault covers a wide range of unwanted behaviors up to, but not including penetration, that are attempted and or completed.
Attempted or completed. So if someone even tries to harm us sexually, that's assault.
Yes, ma'am. Sexual assault may involve actual or threatened physical force, the use of weapons, coercion, intimidation, or pressure that may include anything from voyeurism to exhibitionism, undesired exposure to pornography. So it involves a lot.
So rape is the legal term used to identify some sexual assault offenses. Can you tell us legally what rape is?
Well, rape definitions, of course, are going to vary from state to state in response to legislative advocacy, but most statutes are currently defining rape as the non-consensual oral, anal, or vaginal penetration of a victim by body parts or by objects using force or threats of bodily harm or by taking advantage of a person that's incapacitated or otherwise not able to give their consent.
So rape is a form of sexual violence, but it's not the only form of sexual violence that's illegal, right?
No, there are many different forms of sexual violence, and one of which is rape that's involved with domestic violence situations or intimate partner situations. A lot of times you're going to have some sexual assault that occurs in a relationship, whether they are partners or spouses or dating partners. It's going to be some of those situations where the violence or the power and control dynamic involves sexual assault.
So Juanita, how does sexual assault relate to domestic violence?
Well, sexual assault in a relationship rarely exists in a vacuum. It's often going to occur alongside other forms of abusive behavior. The majority of women who are physically assaulted by an intimate partner also have been sexually assaulted by that same partner.
So what more can you tell us about sexual assault between intimate partners and married couples?
Well, there are many different terms that people use. It is included intimate partner sexual violence, domestic violence, intimate partner rape, marital rape. Regardless of what the term is that you use, it's sexual violence that's occurring in a relationship that's someone that's an intimate person in your life.
Is it against the law for your partner to force you into sexual activity?
Absolutely. No matter what term you use to describe it, it is never okay to force someone to engage in sexual activity without their consent.
So how does sexual assault relate to family violence outside of the intimate relationships? For example, incest.
Well, incest is a term that refers to unwanted sexual contact between family members.
How many child victims of sexual assault are abused by family members?
Well, the majority of victims know their perpetrator, and approximately about 34% of perpetrators in cases of child sexual abuse are family members. This is an issue that impacts many people, and while it may be very difficult to talk about because it's so personal, people need to know that they're not alone if they've experienced incest and that it is never the victim's fault.
Well, let's talk more about child sexual abuse.
Child sexual abuse is a form of child abuse that includes sexual activity with a minor. A child can't consent to any form of sexual activity, period.
So what constitutes sexual activity when we're talking about child abuse?
Well, child sexual abuse does not need to include physical contact, although it may. Um, some forms of child sexual abuse are fondling and intercourse, exposing oneself to a minor, masturbation in the presence of the child, or making the minor masturbate them, um, producing, owning, and sharing pornographic images. So it can involve quite a few things, including sex trafficking.
Are children at greater or lesser risk if they're only allowed around family members or close friends?
Well, many perpetrators of sexual abuse are in a position of trust or responsible for the child's care. And that could be their family member, a teacher, a clergy member, a coach. It's somebody that they trust, which opens that door for there to be the vulnerability for sexual assault situations to occur.
A lot of guilt comes with sexual assault, even though it isn't the victim's fault at all. Another sexual assault that kind of tricks the victim into feeling some responsibility is date rape or drug facilitated sexual assault. Can you explain this?
Well, yes, drug facilitated sexual assaults occur when there's alcohol or drugs that have been used to compromise someone's ability to be able to consent to the activity. Um, the substances make it a little bit easier for the perpetrator to commit the sexual assault because it inhibits the other person's ability to resist or prevent them from even remembering that the assault happened. There are terms called the date rape drug. They refer to substances that can aid the perpetrator in making sure that the person doesn't have the ability to consent to the sexual activity that's about to happen.
How does this kind of sexual assault happen? Like if a victim were to drink voluntarily or get high on purpose, does that mean the victim's at fault?
Absolutely not. That's why we opened up talking about consent. It is very important. If a person is incapacitated in some way and cannot give consent, then someone trying to commit a sexual act against them is illegal and it is not the victim's fault. And sometimes drug facilitated rapes can open up the door for there to be other types of sexual violence that take place. Sometimes you may have a multiple perpetrator sexual assault that takes place in situations where the victim is incapacitated and can't speak for themselves.
So what does multiple perpetrator sexual assault mean?
Well, sometimes people call it gang rape or different terms for it, but it occurs when two or more perpetrators act together to sexually assault someone. Gang rape is an example of a terrible thing that can happen in a group setting. Although it isn't necessarily perpetrated by gang members, just like prison rape, it's a rape that is necessarily perpetrated by a prisoner.
So who else might perpetrate prisoner rape?
Well, it's any act that can be committed against an inmate, and it may be with another inmate, it may be that it's a staff member that's committing the act. It doesn't have to be an inmate. And by default, because they are in jail or in prison, inmates can't give consent for any sexual activity.
So, are there any limitations to a prisoner's rights if they've been sexually assaulted?
No, they can receive the same assistance that anyone else had received that sexual assaulted.
So, Juanita, you mentioned before that sexual violence is a broad spectrum of unwanted sexual behaviors. One that we haven't talked about yet is sexual harassment. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. It includes unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature in the workplace or in a learning environment. Sexual harassment doesn't always have to be specifically about sexual behavior or directed at a specific person. For example, there may be some negative comments about women as a group that may be a form of sexual harassment.
So, it can be harassment based on your sex.
Sometimes, yes.
Okay. So, where does sexual harassment typically occur?
Most people think about it in terms of the workplace. It can be in like a school or university setting. It can happen in many different scenarios, including after-hour conversations with peers or coworkers, exchanges in the hallway, non-office settings for employees or peers. It can happen anywhere.
What's interesting is that you were talking about how it could happen after hours or in a non-work setting with peers or coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
So if it does happen at those irregular times or places, does that kind of lend fault to the victim?
Not the victim's fault. Anytime there's a sexual violence that occurs, it is not the victim's fault.
Is there a typical harasser? What does sexual harassment usually look like?
Well, a harasser can identify with any gender and have any relationship to a victim, but it's usually going to occur when there's a authority position over someone. So it can be like a direct manager or a supervisor, a teacher, someone who has that ability to impact them because they have an authoritative role over them. And as far as what it looks like, there are many different forms. It can take the form of physical acts. It can take the form of requesting sexual favors for someone, like a quid pro quo, unwanted sexual touching, unwelcome sexual advances. It can be verbal or of a sexual nature itself. It can encompass lots of different behaviors.
So, sexual harassment and date rape were both things that seem to be common among college age students and adults. Another thing that seems to be common is sexual violence over social media with the advent of like Facebook and Twitter and sites where people can share pictures of each other. Can you tell us more about sexual violence through technology?
Sure. It is fast growing, and I'll start off by saying our laws have not kept up with the fast pace of technology. So there's a long way for us to go in that respect. But it involves simply using digital photos or videos, apps, in order to engage in harassing behavior, um, to commit sexual um, conduct in a way that no consent's been given or without permission of someone, to have, say, a picture to be relayed over the internet. It can involve things from manipulating someone to say, if you don't do this, then I'm going to release this. So it can take the form of a lot of different things. We were talking earlier about intimate partners. So you may have an intimate partner situation where you are freely sharing pictures with each other with the anticipation it was going to stay with your partner. Sometimes that doesn't stay that way. In a sexual assault situation, that partner may get mad and decide to upload those pictures onto the internet. That's another form of sexual assault.
So, Juanita, what are some other ways that this can happen?
Well, stealing personal images not intended for public sharing, harassing someone through gaming platforms. It could take the form in lots of different ways. unsolicited sharing of pornographic images, sending them to people who don't want the image sent to them. So it's not just sharing someone's image, but sending them to someone who doesn't want to even receive the image.
Such as revenge porn?
Yes, revenge porn is a common problem on the internet today. It's one of those things where, however, you have to pay attention to what the laws are saying for your state. With all of the technology and all of the other sexual violence that we have mentioned today, you really do have to check with your state to see what the statutes and the sentencings are for those particular issues for your state.
So we've talked about a lot of different things today. What would be a sort of takeaway that you'd like for our viewers to go home with after watching this?
Well, the important piece to remember, no matter what type of sexual violence has occurred, it is not the survivor's fault. The perpetrator is at fault for their behavior. So I want victims and survivors to understand that it is not their fault. And I would also say I would want people to remember that if you have been sexually assaulted, that you can call Avalon. We have a 24-hour helpline, and that number is 757-258-5051, and find out what free and confidential support services are available to you.
Thank you for joining us for our second episode of Voices by Avalon. Be sure to check us out next week as we talk about what to do if you've been sexually assaulted. Thanks for tuning in.